Okay, well, thank you everyone. I prefer to talk if I can help it standing up. There was an old lesson from a Christian brother, Brother Bell, who many of you would have heard about, and he taught mathematics at Edmund Rice and taught me and hundreds, thousands of other boys. But anyway, he'd say, he was 68 years old at the time, and he'd say, boys, I always stand up when I teach, and the moment you see me sitting down, that's when you can say, the old man's had it. Which of course went over really well for 13, 14-year-old boys. But anyway, so I just like to do that. Just a little bit about the background of this talk. So it's called Spiritual Fatherhood and the Role of Women in Priests' Lives. It's actually come together, it's one of those talks that came together sort of in a few months, but 25 years, if that makes sense. So it's a whole lot of things that just gelling together over years as a priest, ministering different parishes. Many of you would know this, I've had the privilege of serving as a priest in 4 different countries, and it's just, while I was doing other things there, it's just all an experience. So Malta, the US, Italy, and of course our own country, Australia. And it's interesting, the different cultures, the different languages sometimes, but all of that, it just cuts across, it becomes irrelevant, because when we're talking about something like man and woman, you realize we're all the same, very much so. You know, like women in Australia are not really all that different to women in the US, or women in Italy, or women in Malta. So, but it's interesting, sometimes precisely having those cultural differences are the very things that highlight one's attention to a particular issue. So I'm really grateful for that. The other thing too that I should mention by way of background is whenever it comes time for me to finish up from a parish and go to another, one of the things I often do is to thank the people of that parish for their own impact upon me. One of the things that's commonly done is obviously to thank the priest for the contribution he's made and so forth, and fair enough, rightly so. But by the same token, what's often understated is the impact that people have on a priest. And so, if there's something good that you find and see in a priest who comes to your parish, thank God for all the other places that he's been, because he didn't turn out that way just by his own efforts alone. I remember when I first started out as a priest, the parish priest at the time said to me, you know, Mark, the seminary has done a lot to help you and form you and so forth, but the contribution your own family has made is something you can never calculate. And at that time, at 25 years of age, I really didn't give that much consideration. But thanks be to God, though, a lot of other things have been given along the way by the various communities. What inspired this talk? 2 key moments in particular. One is my father's death. So that happened when I was 31, so 20 years ago. And that gave me a chance to ponder about spiritual fatherhood in a way and at a depth that I really hadn't done so up to that point. And what I mean is that in the church we talk about the spiritual fatherhood of the priest, the spiritual fatherhood of the bishop, the spiritual fatherhood of the Holy Father. In fact, we call him by that name, Holy Father. But what does it actually mean? Is it simply a reduction to, okay, well, he gives supernatural life through the sacraments, just as a natural father gives natural life through having children with his wife? Does it just mean that, or does it mean something else? Well, obviously the answer is it means something much more than just simply giving supernatural life through the sacraments. The other point that has really inspired this talk as well is a letter that was written by St. John Paul II. During his 27 years of papacy, St. John Paul II always wrote a letter to priests on Holy Thursday, which, as we know, is the feast of the priesthood. And he, except for 2 years, I think he missed out, must have been ill or something like that. I think 90. Anyway, the one that really caught my eye when I was reading these letters They're basically his, just letters he's written, so a few pages long. One of them was called, in 1995, the year I happened to be ordained, it was called The Role of Women in Priests' Lives. Now, St. John Paul II was a phenomenal pope, but also a phenomenal human being, because he had an amazing humanity, a very mature man, but also one who is so confident and equally relaxed with men and with women. And this is not always something you find, certainly in priests, bishops, or popes. And everyone has his or her own, or his own personality when it comes to priests. But the fact is, more than probably 2/3, 3/4 of the people that a priest ministers to in his parishes are women. So it was just a beautiful letter. So that has also served very much as an insight into this talk. All the examples I will use will not be from this parish. So for obvious reasons, okay? And but there'll be other different parishes. I won't even mention which country they've come from. A lot of my information obviously is going to be second-hand stuff because I've got my experience, but it's come from other priests that I've discussed with, different parishes, different experiences, but there'll be true stories that I will certainly share with you. And so I want to talk then, just to take you through then, the structure of the talk will be, so spiritual fatherhood, I want to talk a bit about that, and going from a theological sense to the humanity of Jesus and how that was formed particularly by Saint Joseph. But then also the role of women in priests' lives, because I want to talk a bit about the relationship between priests and the women who minister to them and who, in a sense, work closely with them. And if they don't realize it, or although they don't realize it, they're actually ministering to the priest in an indirect way. So I say this to you, and hopefully in some sense many of you would have already realized this, that the impact you have. But if you haven't, you will see the impact you've had in your own contacts with priests, and to see that your influence is probably way bigger than you have realized. And only in heaven will we see fully. What I would have loved to do if we had the time is to actually have an individual conversation, or even maybe in small groups, it's too big as we are, to discuss what are your expectations, or what have been some of your highlights in relationships with priests. But it's not really the time or the forum for that. So I know that there's a lot that you could have an input into and teach me about this, either to confirm what I'm going to say to you, or to further nuance the various experiences that I've had and putting things together. So I realize I'm talking to an audience here that is also very rich in what you've experienced, but anyway, so I'm going to make my little contribution and then we'll go from there. Clear where we're going? Okay, great. And then towards the end, of course, I'm talking about the role of women in priests' lives, the different types of relationships that women can have with their priests. And I'll talk some of the positive stuff, but also talk about somehow things can go wrong as well, because this is all part of the gamut of how things play out. So spiritual fatherhood. Spiritual fatherhood, as I said, for me, my own understanding, received a big kick along when my own father had died 20 years ago. And as you could understand, it made me think deeply about how was my dad my father. And I had no rose-colored glasses about my father. He was a very virtuous man, but he was also not a saint. And he had his faults, his weaknesses, and as I grew older, I could see through them. I remember when the experience of fatherhood, in fact, experiences or begins in childhood, because we experience our own human fathers. And some are really good at it, and most struggle with it at some point, and some, unfortunately, are not all that good. But the reality is, when children come into a family, do they come with instructions? No, they don't. So you do your best, you do what you've been taught, and you go from there. So as I was going from my teenage years or adolescent years into young adulthood, I was already in the seminary. I remember one of the things that I could never figure out was I would be butting heads with my father. Particularly, I would never take Dad on in terms of his own specialty, which was anything practical, mechanic, welding, plumbing. He was really brilliant in these things, and I wish I had him around here to spearhead my maintenance committee, you know. But anyway, that's coming, you know. Not that I'm dropping any hints or anything, but that was what, so I was too smart to take him on for that. But when it came to theological stuff, I thought, yeah, I could handle my own here. Now, Dad, of course, was a bright man in his own way, and he never had a chance to go much schooling except to year 8. And he was the eldest of 10 children. Can you imagine growing up in a war-torn country, being bombed World War II and so forth, Malta? But he prided himself on having a good knowledge of the faith. But it was a catechetical knowledge. It wasn't a theological knowledge. So I thought I had the edge. But so when we're having our debates, we'd be there, and we're arguing away, and then when he knew he wasn't getting the upper hand, he'd say, I don't know what sort of a priest you're going to make, you know, you're going to lead people astray, you know. And then this continued, you know, after I was ordained as well, so 26, 27, and he'd say, what, you tell these things people in confession, you give them this advice, you're going to lead them astray, you're not leading them to God. And I thought, and I knew that was his version of a white flag. Now, put all that aside, what was really going on? It took me quite a while, as in a number of years, because we're in those family relationships, we're very close to the people, and it's hard for us to kind of step back enough and get a perspective that will then help us to understand what's going on. And let's face it, in family life, you don't exactly go to your local counsellor and say, oh, look, could you just listen to us as we're having a debate here and see what's going on? So I realised what was going on is a young man going into adulthood, trying to establish his independence from his father and be an adult with his father. And then a father trying to recognise that the little puppy that, you know, he'd seen from nothing is growing up into a man and actually knows something about the things that he treasures the most, the Catholic faith, and knows something more about those things than he does. That was difficult for him to accept. But I realized it wasn't about the issue of faith or anything like that. It was really a son and a father both going through the adjustment. And that is something now many of you as mothers would find the same thing going on with your own sons and daughters. And I want to put it to you that this is a fundamental lesson, has been certainly for me, in understanding spiritual fatherhood. Now you might say, well, this is a human fatherhood. It's true, but spiritual fatherhood parallels the human fatherhood. And if we don't draw insight from human fatherhood, then the priest will risk having just a head knowledge or an academic knowledge of what it means to be a father, a spiritual father, and risk not connecting and understanding the true needs of his people. So eventually what happened in the last 4 years of his life, I came to the understanding, this is just to conclude the story, to the understanding that Dad as a father, is always the head. It's never a parent with his son or daughter. You're never equals. And one of the mistakes that I see often parents make, particularly the younger generation of parents, is to treat their children as somehow their friends. Big mistake. Children need to be parented. But then what happens is in adult life, at least this has been my experience, in adult life, there can be a friendship there because now they're both adults. However, there's always the senior party in the relationship. And I found as long as I respected that and acknowledged that in my father, then the relationship was actually very, very good. And I realized that. Now, when you come to spiritual fatherhood, something similar is also going on. because the priest is also raising children. But he's raising, in most cases, adult children. And he's helping or trying to raise them in the spiritual life. And the spiritual life doesn't mean just some kind of head knowledge about Jesus Christ, but rather helping them to grow and to mature and to deepen in their own humanity, to realize what it means to be a son or a daughter of God. That is a tough thing to do, because it means being a father both of people who are younger than you and people who are older than you. And again, do you think they gave me any instructions of this in the seminary? Absolutely not. Absolutely. So I turn to the saints. I turn to the great teachers around. I turn to other men in the parish or wherever I know them in their own fatherhood. Now, one of the insights I've come to see about spiritual fatherhood is that, and I think too, also human fatherhood, is that fatherhood is one of those lessons that we learn, and it's not actually just a lesson, it's a process that we learn precisely by receiving. We can only imitate it, and I would say this is equally true of motherhood. We learn fatherhood and motherhood by being fathered and mothered. Precisely in being fathered or mothered, we are then able to replicate that in another. I found after my father died, instinctively turning to some of the older men in the parish at that time, whom I found as father figures. And what was I looking for? My father was a very strong character and could be quite opinionated in various things, whether you asked for the opinion or not, you're going to get it at some stage. But excuse me, but these other men were also strong in their character, but a very different angle. I found myself being fathered by them in the way they gave me advice, in the way they talked to me, that they respected me, and so forth. You hear all the things that I was looking for in my own father. And by the way, there are 3 A's that we all look for, but particularly from our parents. And this is, I would say, it's universal. Attention, affection, and approval. The triple A, attention, affection, and approval. We look for those 3 things from all sorts of people, but particularly from our parents. Now, if I was going to be a good spiritual father to my people, to those to whom I am ministering, I began to instinctively realize that I needed to be fathered myself. That fatherhood, is one of those lessons that leaks if it's not replenished. So that's why I was seeking to be fathered from these other men. By the way, to this day, they don't know what was going on, right? And they've all gone to heaven now. So, but that's what I was turning to. And I didn't need to tell them that. There was no exploitation or anything going on. But it was just a realization that you, by giving me this attention, affection, and approval, and guiding me as I needed to, I was able to then guide others. And don't get me wrong, these men were also capable when I needed to hear it, to tell me when I was doing the wrong thing in their eyes, and I needed to be corrected. And it's rare, I find, to come across someone in the parish who loves you enough to pull you aside and in a respectful way say, look, can I say something? Oh, yeah, go ahead. Look, A, B, C, whatever. And sometimes it was awkward for them to say that, but to this day, I really am grateful for that. Now, I thought, is this just me, or is this actually something deeper that's going on? So then I turned, as you do in prayer and so forth, and I'm thinking theologically and spiritually, this must be something more universal that's going on. Because I look at Jesus. He's the eternal Son of the Father. From all eternity, God the Father was his Father, and his being was drawn from the Father. Okay, that's nice and doctrinal and very philosophical. But when he came to this earth, what does God the Father ensure? That Jesus is born into a human family. And not just to have a mother, but to have a human father as well. And although St. Joseph wasn't Jesus' dad, he was very much a father to Jesus. Quite apart from making sure that Jesus was born in a legitimate family according to Jewish law and so forth, that's really quite secondary in the book. The fact that Jesus was raised, that his humanity was shaped by a father and a mother, is actually a profound reality about how God sees human fatherhood and motherhood. St. John Paul II, in his letter, Pope Francis recently has written a letter. As you'll be aware, we've been printing various sections of it in consecutive order in the bulletin each Sunday. I've just had a break the last few weeks. But St. John Paul II also wrote a letter about St. Joseph called The Guardian of the Redeemer. And he says, if we want to know about St. Joseph, what does he say? What does he answer? He says, this is typical John Paul II style and in his philosophy. He says, look at the incarnation. In other words, look at the chip off the old block. Look at the humanity of Christ. And we've got an ample picture of that in the Gospels. We see that he's humble and tender and gentle and humble of heart. But he also had passion, and he could make a whip out of some cord and chase people out of the temple. So where does Jesus get all this from? St. Joseph was a master in shaping his own humanity, the humanity of Jesus. And Our Lady shaped the humanity of Jesus in her own way, as only a mum could do. This is why so much of the sexual confusion of our age and the gender, confusion and fluidity and all that is in fact confusion. It's not according to God's mind. So, excuse me. So, the human fatherhood, therefore, and the spiritual fatherhood have a great parallel with each other. Now, let's go a bit further on, and then I'll go to the role of women in priests' lives, because women, what I'm going to get to is, they are the ones who are actually shaping the fatherhood of the priest. The fatherhood which St. Joseph exercised, do you think it just came instinctively to him? For the most part, yes. But I think there was another standby who was also telling him certain things to say to their son. I think Our Lady has a great influence about how St. Joseph taught and shaped Jesus. Mind you, I also believe it went in the other direction, where St. Joseph would have suggested things to Our Lady that it's better for her to talk to him about them. So you see how mum and dad are working closely together to shape their greatest treasure, i.e. their child, their children in the larger family. So the humanity of Jesus is in fact shaped profoundly by this human fatherhood and motherhood. And I remember reading some years ago, and I was reading some private revelation, and our Lord said to this particular young gentleman, he says, I obeyed St. Joseph when I was on this earth, and I still obey him now in heaven. Turn to him, ask him for what you need, and he will obtain things for you. And I think it was really inspired how Pope Francis, in fact, has instituted this year of St. Joseph in the Universal Church. But let's take it a step further with human fatherhood and spiritual fatherhood. Excuse me. When fathers, and many of you are married and you've seen your husbands raise children more or less well, sometimes more, sometimes less, but you see how they are shaping their children. Great, your children. And, well, what happens? I often thought if I were married, my first child would have been a basket case, because I would have tried to make them perfect, and I would have failed. My second child would have been another basket case, because I would have learned from my mistakes from my previous child and realized I'm not engaged and hands-on enough. So they would be suffering from a loss of direction in their life, and then maybe my third child would have turned out all right, you know. But so 1 out of 3 is bad, you know. 2 out of 3 ain't bad, but 1 out of 3 is not that good. So, but okay, what happens in human fatherhood is when we make mistakes, well, we can't undo them, can we? We live with it. You know, if we've hurt a child in some way, and I don't mean necessarily physically or excessively, but emotionally, whatever, then we can't undo that. But what we try to do is to make up for it. And then with another child, we try to improve on that. And then it finally dawns on us, oh, each child is different. Gosh, I can't just draw the same parallels. You know how you're all grown up in the same family and you're all so blooming different, you know? Did you come from the milkman or something, you know? What's going on? And that's the uniqueness of a different soul and body. But when you're talking about spiritual fatherhood and the priest is carrying on his ministry, you actually have a chance to start again. I've made mistakes in different parishes, but I'd like to think that as I've gone from different parishes, I've learned from the various mistakes and tried not to repeat them, meanwhile to consolidate on the good things that I've done by God's grace and to refine those even further. So if I were to do an examination or a study of your various families and see what has happened with human fatherhood, I would see the mistakes, but also what has been improved on, but also some of the things that you just live with. I remember early on a priest said to me that, Mark, some situations in the parish you cannot help, you cannot change, and so you just live with the consequences. And that was an important lesson for a young priest full of idealism and enthusiasm to actually accept, you know what, we are only ministers and we're all imperfect and we can't have everything sorted out. So then what I realized is that as the priest moves, someone's got their phone going. Oh, sorry. Still going. Yeah, okay, hasn't ruined the thing. Sorry about that. As we're moving then from different parishes, what a priest learns is how to be a better father, particularly if he's understood this image. And it's right there through the documents, Vatican II, and so forth. So we've got now, hopefully, clear that fatherhood is something that constantly needs to be replenished in order to be able to be given. The moment the source dries up, the priest, in this case, I feel, will be risking running dry or running aground. Now, by the way, the source that can come from, how he's being fathered himself, doesn't necessarily have to be by people who are older than him. This is the mysterious thing, because a priest is called to be a father to people older than him, and equally, if the priest is going to be fathered, there will come a time when there will be people younger than him who will also be fathering him. So I know that cuts across the intuition because it doesn't go according to the natural flow. We immediately turn to people who are older than us, or at least our age and maturity, for advice. But the reality is that doesn't always follow suit or follow the course. But then, as a priest is moving from different parishes, he's hopefully also growing in his own maturity, in his own humanity. And this is where the women play a big part. One of the jokes really said to me, but there's some truth in it, said, oh, Father, a married man has one woman telling him what to do. A priest has every woman telling him what to do. Now, that's an exaggeration, obviously, but many more women, and I say thanks be to God, feel free to actually come and help the priest. Again, because we're not in an intimate relationship like a marriage, there's a lot of those lessons that are important to shaping the humanity of the priest are often not touched. And so you can see an abrasiveness or something like that, or insensitivity, or I don't know, a hardness or rashness, or just a blind spot. Those things. Now, husbands, they often have, they have their wives, and they may or may not listen, right? But it's, and there can be, what's the word, selective hearing. But the fact is, that is a voice that's speaking into their soul, whether they listen to it or not. With a priest, there isn't that woman right next to him who is feeding in. But don't worry, God takes care of his own if they want to listen, if they want to grow. And this is where then the role of the women is actually very, very important in a priest's life. So as the priest is moving from one parish to another, he is and getting older as he's doing and more experienced. One of the things you hope is also happening is that he is growing in his own maturity, in his own humanity, which means necessarily turning inwards. Now, yes, in the seminary, there's a lot of formation, 6 or 7 years of formation. Great. But that formation in itself is not enough, because formation needs to be given continuously along the way. And just as I said a moment ago, that just as fatherhood needs to be received, that in order to be given, so too the formation, those encounters need to happen. Most of the time, those formation sessions don't happen because of the in-services that we have as priests. We'll have 3-day in-service in July each year in our diocese. We have a half a day in-service in November as well, and that can vary. So that's a fair bit. And then we also have other professional workshops twice a year. But the most formative thing that I feel happens in a priest is his own relationships with his people. And hopefully most of those are actually very healthy and very good and nourishing. Some will be very deep and more influential. And some will be a bit rough and ready, and that's just the way things go. Excuse me. St. John Paul II, though, talks about 3 ways in which a woman has a relationship with the priest, which they can have a relationship. And he really draws his inspiration from St. Paul's letter to Timothy. By the way, when we've got 10 minutes to go, can someone just let me know? I've got confessions at 10, but anyway, we can they can prepare their hearts for the confessions beforehand. So, doesn't matter if we start a few minutes late. So he says the way in which St. Paul gives advice to Timothy, and he says, treat the older women like your mother. Treat the women, the other women like sisters, and the younger women with propriety. And St. John Paul II explains and expands what all this means. So these are kind of 3 general ways in which women will relate to the priest, as a mother, as a sister, or as a daughter in the case of the younger women. And this is something that has been a joy, because I've seen it over the years, obviously starting out 26 years ago nearly. There was the idea of a sister or a mother was actually the only experience I had. But now, as I look at some of my classmates from school who are fathers of young adults now, I realize that relationship has also started. Now, just like anyone, the priest I said earlier, is looking for the 3 A's, attention, affection, and approval, so is everyone else. And the reality is that as we interact with one another and the priest interacts with his parishioners, some will be looking for this more consciously than others. So there are always those in the parish who are just happy to have a business-like relationship with the priest. And we all know them, perhaps we're there ourselves, There are some who just come and pray and make their financial contribution, say hello to their 2 friends, and then off they go. And then there are others, and I thank God for these, who are there who really want to work closely with the priest and want to help him in whatever way they can. But as we're carrying on the work of the kingdom, doing whatever needs to be done, there's also two hearts that are growing together. And this is part of the role of women in the priest's life. And I thank God for the women who have been closer in that realm, who've been able to speak to me. And I see this in many other priests' lives as well, who who have been able to just speak honestly to them about all sorts of things, to encourage them, to support them, to, when the confidence is there closely enough, to be able to say things that need to be changed, things that need to be looked at. And this is not an easy thing to arrive at, because it requires a mutual trust on both sides. With some of the families that I've gotten closer to over the years, what I've sensed is that not only the parents in that family, but then also the children find a confidence with the priest. So that, yes, they always know that you're a priest and there's a certain respect for that, but there's at the same time, there's a real openness and a freedom to say things that would otherwise seem abrupt or out of place. I remember when I first started working in the United States, the university students were there, and then I had another assignment with the missionaries. And in the first probably 6 months to a year, easily the first year I would say, the missionaries were all very respectful of their national chaplain, and so. But then something happened in that second year where they were still very respectful, but now they felt comfortable enough to have little gentle shots at me and little digs here and there, and I felt really happy to hear that, because I thought, wow, they feel comfortable enough to actually say that, knowing I'm not going to take any offense about that and that they could get away with it. And that's where I really started to sense something about that, being a father in a different way. Most of them were in their early 20s, right? And I was sort of in my late 30s at the time. So, mid to late 30s. So even though there wasn't sort of a full generation gap there, nevertheless, there was still that role of the fatherhood. So then, a woman, to go further into the role of women in priests' lives, how does a woman help a priest in his own work? Well, obviously, there has to be a mutual understanding of each other's role. And, we've all probably heard of that miniseries in the early 80s, The Thornbirds, Colin McCulloch's story. Now, that was an eyebrow raiser and all that, and there were 4 initial series done in 83, but then in 97, about 14 years later, there were 2 more episodes done called The Missing Years. Now, I know it was a disordered relationship and all of that. I know that. But I felt it was more clear and the problem wasn't that a priest fell in love with this woman. Falling in love is actually one of the most beautiful things that can happen to us. One of the things that that I've come across in my life, not only as a priest, is to see people who in their adult life have never seemed to fall in love, to be excited, to be understood deeply. And that doesn't mean that there's got to lead to a romantic relationship as such, but rather to have that harmony, to have that closeness in such a way that it's mutually respectful of one's vocation and so forth, and to be supported in that way. So the falling in love in that series isn't the problem, it's the fact that then it led to a disorder, and a disorder that is not, obviously needs to be worked on. But something that came through in the other 2 series that were done later on, which I felt helped to really shed light on the first 4, is when the priest, by that stage a cardinal, says to the woman, "Oh, I've I've realized that you're actually a blessing in my life, you know. And one time a priest friend of mine said, but Mark, at the end of the day, did he save his soul? In other words, did he repent of his, and I don't know, I'd like to think he did, you know, save his soul. But there was certainly a disorder. So that's a kind of a chaotic relationship. But there are other relationships that are actually close and honest and friendly and affectionate, but well ordered. And you might say, well, what sort of a relationship like this looks like? I've only seen it, I don't know, even maybe 5 times in the 4 countries that I've seen, and it's pretty rare, I must say. Obviously, there's various dangers that can be there, and it's got to be the right man and the right woman for these relationships to actually occur. Historically, we see the relationship, for example, between Saint Teresa of Avila and Saint John of the Cross. Very tender, very affectionate, but also very holy, very chaste. They understood each other's vocations. She actually had an even more tender friendship for her confessor, I forget what his name is now, but anyway, and I think at one point Saint Teresa says to him, she's talking very affectionately towards him. He says, oh, pardon me. He was talking very affectionately. Could someone give me a glass of water, please? Thanks. Talking very affectionately and tenderly to him, and he says, oh, but you should be directing all these affections to God. And she says, oh, I love you, Father, but I love God 1,000 times more. You see, now I don't know if he got deflated by that stage, but thank you. But he, thank you. But the fact is, she was, you see, so these relationships can exist, but they're in fact quite rare because it requires a great deal of maturity. And I think I've only seen it about 5 times because obviously I can't, if I see a particular priest who's had, looks like he's got a really close friendship with some woman, I'm not going to probe into it, you know. It's not something that is going to be talked about, and neither should it be talked about because it's very sacred, very, very holy, very personal. But someone very public, whom we've all known about, did have such a relationship, and perhaps 2 that came out after his death, and that's Saint John Paul II, who helped me to inspire this talk in me about the role of women in priest life, and him writing that letter. One of them was Wanda, we would say, and her family used to go on holidays with him, his Cardinal of Krakow and so forth. And when he became Pope, she would have, she had a Vatican passport, so she's walking around Vatican City State, and people are thinking, who's this woman, you know, with her clogs on and whatever. And, but, you know, her spiritual diaries, I believe, have been published now. I haven't read them, but there's her. But then there's also, what's the other one's name? Wanda Poltowska and Halina somebody. And there was a woman that he knew from his early days in the theatre group, and then she went off, got married, he did a couple of baptisms for her children, and then later on she was dying with cancer. He asked Padre Pio, or Saint Pio now, to intercede for her, and she was cured. And in fact, this is captured nicely in a film called Carol, the Man Who Became Pope. Came out in the early 2000s. And then there was part 2, which was also good, but not as good as I thought part 1. And it just focused on his life pre-papacy and post-papacy. But the one who I believe he had the most tender relationship with was a woman whose name won't come to me now, but she was actually a philosopher, and she had migrated to America, and she was actually instrumental in having his work, The Acting Person, or The Person and Act, in the Polish, but in the English it's translated as The Acting Person, published in the English-speaking world. And, you know, when he visited her, had a visit as Pope now in in the United States, you know, he and her would go off on a canoe ride up whatever somewhere, and they would do this. And it's just interesting. It's just beautiful to see that kind of tenderness and that kind of relationship exists in someone in the church who has the highest office. Her letters to him have been donated to the Polish National Library, and they've been published. I haven't read those, but his responses to her won't be published for probably many years from now, until everybody basically dies who knew him, and then I'm sure they will be made public. But I'm just putting this out there because it's a rare relationship, and I think I've seen it. I keep saying that I think I've seen it because you know, I can't exactly ask these priests, but I've seen how the influence in their lives, there seems to be a realism about them that is very real, very tangible there. And this is obviously the role of the women, or the woman, I don't know, in his particular life. The last point I'll finish off on is, how are we going with time? It's good, yeah. Oh, great, thank you. So is the fact that our Lord Himself didn't just go around with the 12, He also had a group of women from the upper class who looked after Him from their own means. Now, some of them He'd healed from various ailments. Mary of Magdala, you know, St. Gregory the Great talks about, you know, cast out 7 demons. Actually, the Gospels talk about that. So Jesus had healed a lot of these women. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't imagine that Christ would have just used these women as the bank supply to keep Him and the apostles fed and not develop a good relationship with each of them. So in fact, Jesus had with Him a community of men and women. And it's interesting that St. John Paul II and Benedict as well had men and women in their palace. The women it was a community of nuns, and sometimes they would have meals together and so forth, but it was a way of keeping that balance in the humanity. But also St. John Paul II used to, in his years as a chaplain to the university students there, they used to call him wujek, which is Polish for uncle. And he would go and spend, of course under communism, that was the code, so that he was known as the priest and be arrested, right? And he would take the students one by one and go canoeing with them. And they would just talk and talk and talk. He would spend hours counseling couples in marriage preparation. I mean, so many of them have taught me so many things. And we talk into details, as you could just imagine, you know, what works for you, what doesn't work for you, what excites you, what frustrates you, all those things. And all of these are very, very important. And you as women have an unimaginable contribution to make in the role of priests. Think of the priests for a moment that you've come in contact with over the years. And perhaps with some you've been closer to than others, but you know, in different ways. And just see the impact that you've perhaps made on them, but also the impact that they've made on you. So I say these things because it'll be very few who will be in that kind of close role. For the majority of women, their role in helping priests to be better fathers, spiritual fathers, will be through that support, that encouraging word, that listening heart, that is, of course, in addition to the prayer, that you can provide for them in your own relationships with them, however they may be. And whether that's as a sister in Christ, as a mother figure, or as a daughter, regardless, each of those three roles are in fact very valuable and have their own contribution to keep the priest as a spiritual father anchored in his own humanity and balanced and keeping on growing in his own maturity and holiness. That's the end from my side. We've run out of time. There's a lot more things that can be said, obviously, but it's too much for today. But I'm happy to take questions for a few minutes. before we wrap it up.
Can I just have
Any comments?
the
Yeah.
one Pope John Paul II, because there was one published in Catholic Weekly about Pope John Paul II about St. Joseph of Fatherhood. There was one article that was written about what.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that. There was a letter he wrote on St. Joseph called The Guardian of the Redeemer, Redemptoris Custos in Latin, but it was, now you're testing me, when did it come out? I want to say 91, but I'm not sure. If you looked up the Vatican website under St. John Paul II, you will find all his writings there. So, any other questions or comments?
You didn't mention Francis of St. Francis of Assisi and St. Clare.
I didn't mention that, but it's a very peculiar relationship, that one, because they only saw each other once a year, those two, and I don't think it's actually a good example that can be lived in real life. I mean, unless you're monastics, right?
Mm.
I'm saying, I mean, your role, you meet priests, regularly, each week, every day, or whatever it happens to be, every few weeks, and there's a particular contribution that can be made there in the life of a priest. So, and this is, I wish, for instance, St. John Paul II has made a great contribution in his theology of the body to advance the Church's understanding of married love. But I wish St. John Paul III comes along, or I look forward to St. John Paul III, to talk about how celibate intimacy can actually be played out, because it's real. See, in the beginning, years and years ago, when I was in the seminary, I used to think that celibate intimacy, or celibacy rather, means that there's no intimacy at all in a priest's life, which would be a deadly thing, because it means love cannot be present there. But as I've gone along, I've realized, no, that's actually a misunderstanding. Celibacy means an absence of genital intimacy, but it doesn't mean an absence of intimacy per se. So there could be close friendships there, and as providing that they are prudent and discreet, and there's a maturity and a mutual respect for one another, that can exist. Now, obviously, it's fairly rare. It's not rare to have that closeness. That's not rare at all. I've seen that many, many times. But to have those more exclusive sort of relationships that I referred to, that is fairly rare. But, so I'd love to have a Pope.
But as you go into life,
Yes.
my first, I was a non-Catholic, then I became a Catholic, and
Right,
my
yeah.
first was Father Gallagher.
Yes.
Then it was Father Dowden, and then of course I went to Berkeley. So
Mhm.
that was it was different times along the way.
There
And
were.
then there was Father Joe sort of thing. So
Yes.
it's a different, all the way along from the different ages.
True. So just as the priest gets older and learns from his experiences over the years, so too lay people, or women in this case, will learn in their different experiences of priests as they get older, notwithstanding the obvious differences in different personalities of the priests. Some are going to be more gentle, some are going to be more forceful, but there's, interestingly, we all need those AAA, the attention, affection, approval. And what you'll find is, what you are able to give to one priest, you won't be able to give to another, because of the different. But just see in your own mind that this could be the way that God is using you to actually make a contribution to Him. And if you make a contribution to Him, you're actually making a contribution to the parish and ultimately to the diocese. Because, I mean, I just look at St. John Paul II. His mother died when he was 4. His older brother died when he was 8. His father died when he was 8, sorry. His older brother, Edmund, died, he was a medical doctor, when he was 22, and he was all alone. But, thank God, there were lots of other people to shape him, and all those Polish young university students and men and women who helped him gave the church a treasure and a richness that influences us all. So, you never know what your impact could have. Maybe a last comment before. Great. Well, thank you for listening, and yeah.